Hello everyone and welcome. I'm here with another card idea that you can make for Valentine's Day. I thought it would be fun to paint galaxy background using pink paints. Here are the products I will be using, two pinks, black, and I also added purple, but that's pretty much optional. I have also white gouache for the stars. I will be using a stamp for the greeting and a die. If you do not have those, for the greeting you could, for example, create a banner. And you can find the product list over on my blog. The link is in the description. I taped my cardstock onto a board using a washi to prevent warping, and then I started painting. For my first layer, I did the wet on wet technique. I applied clean water over the whole cardstock. You don't want the water to be pooling, you need enough water to get a nice light sheen. Then I used my lighter pink and I added the paint onto my watercolor cardstock, really just randomly. And because the paper was already wet, the paint reacted with water and spread around. I also left a few spots without any paint, and then I used the darker pink and added it to some of the parts where I added the lighter pink, and then I let it dry. If you do not have two different pink paints, that's okay, you can achieve this with just one paint. Which I actually did here as well. I started with very light wash of pink, then I intensified the paint by using less water, and then I added the darker pink. By the way, you could use any other color, you don't have to use pinks, just use color that the person you're making the card for likes. For example, if you are making a card for a boyfriend or a husband who likes blue, you could make a blue galaxy with some greens, which would also look very nice. After the piece was dry, I used more saturated paint and I was switching between the pinks, and I was applying the paint around the lighter areas, doing the wet on dry technique, which means the paper was dry. The darkest pink I used especially around the edges of the cardstock where I wanted it to be darker. With my brush, I was doing this dabbing motion as I was applying the paint. I did this on other galaxy backgrounds that I made in the past, and I really like this technique as it creates an interesting cloud-like texture. Once I was happy with the look, I used a clean water to smoothen out the edges along the lighter areas. As you can see, the edges of the pink paint around the white area are pretty harsh, so I wanted to smooth them out. I started in the middle of the lighter area using just a clean water. You don't want to have too much water on the brush. And I was going from the middle towards the pink paint, and as the pink and the clean water mixed, it smoothed out the edges. I also was working with the brush to smooth them out and combine them together. If you get paint where you don't want to, clean your brush, soak it up on a paper towel so it's slightly dry, and go back to those lighter areas that you want to lighten up and soak up the color, cleaning your brush in between. While the paint was still wet, I also added some purple here and there. However, this is completely optional. You see it only slightly afterwards. I let the piece completely dry, and then I used a black paint and I went around the light areas over the pink in a dabbing motion. In some areas, I only use very light coat of the black, and in other areas, I added more saturated paint. As I was painting, I was also softening the lighter areas with clean damp brush, and where I got too much paint, I did the lifting technique. If you do not want to use black, you could try dark blue or even the purple might work. And also, depending on the watercolor cardstock you use, you will get different results. When I painted galaxy backgrounds before, I used different cardstock and the cloud-like texture was much visible there. Also, one more thing, I'm using here the Canson XL, which is a cheap watercolor cardstock. And if you are using a cheaper watercolor cardstock, you need to be more careful with the water. Although I did not have big problems here. But it's good to understand your cardstock and what you can achieve with it. Some techniques will work, some will not, or will look different. I let the piece fully dry and then I added the stars. I used a little bit of white gouache mixed with a little bit of water. You could use an acrylic paint as well. I dipped my brush into it, and by tapping my brush, I sprinkled the paint over the background. I always have troubles when trying to add stars as I don't want it to look like snow. When the splatter is too big, it just to me looks like snow. You want to use smaller brush for smaller splatter. Here I used a long bristle brush in the size 2, which did create a much smaller splatter. However, as always, what it did not disappoint in was creating the mess. Happens to me all the time. So I let the piece dry and next I stamped the greeting. I used the words love you from this stamp set. If you do not have stamps, as I said, you could create a banner, maybe painted black, and write the greeting with a white gel pen and adhere that in the middle of the panel. Or if you have a diamond label maker, you could also use that. Just creating some kind of banner so you can see the greeting, I think that would be the best way to go. Here I decided to heat emboss the greeting. I treated the cardstock with an anti-static powder. Then I stamped the greeting with the Versamark ink. I sprinkled the white embossing powder over it and heat set it with my heat tool. Lastly, I adhered the watercolor panel onto a white card base, and I also attached this wreath with hearts, which is completely optional. The wreath I die cut from a white cardstock. The die is from Avery L. I really love this die. I also have the one with stars, and I like to use it whenever the project is right. I adhered it in the middle of the panel. I used a foam tape for it. I cut it into very tiny pieces, so it's a little bit raised. So here is the finished card. I really love the result. This is exactly what I had in mind, and I hope you will give this painting a try. It's really pretty much painting blobs of color. As I said, I made galaxy backgrounds before. For one, I used just one watercolor paint, and for the other one, I used distress inks and I did the ink smooshing technique. So if you're interested, check those out. That is all for this video. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I will be back with a new card idea very soon.